Thank you for being on the Lessons of Vietnam show with us tonight. Today is 27th of January, 2021. I'm glad, well, I guess everybody's glad to get rid of 2020. But today is the anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords that was signed today in 1973, and that set off the removal of American military combat troops withdrawal. Saturday is a special day for me. Right now, 53 years ago, I was in Hawaii. But Saturday, the January is the celebration, or I'm not certain celebration would be the right word, but it's the anniversary of the Tet Offensive in 1968. It's coming Saturday. So we didn't win. We won the war there, but Congress decided to give it to the bad guys. So tonight our show is a two-part, second part of the understanding of the Vietnam War, as outstanding rant by Tom did. This is, I said, the Lessons of Vietnam show. We try to tell the real story of the Vietnam War. Always looking for guests to come in and tell their part of the war or whatever, or their opinion of war. If you're a war protester or you stayed home with someone. I am your host, Bill Dixon, of Vietnam 67, 68, as I just mentioned. I was there for the Tet. Met my wife in Hawaii right now, and tomorrow night, tomorrow night I'll be on the way back to Vietnam. We are being broadcast at the courtesy of Nissan Communications, their world headquarters here in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you want to get in touch with me, you can contact me at dixonbill80@yahoo.com. But more important, if you want to participate in the show, and we always want you to do that if you'd like, to give your opinions or comments, or tell us that we're wrong or whatever, or tell us we're right. That's okay too. Call us at 919-518-9773. Well, even better, if you want to go on Skype, you can do it by Skype. Go into Computers 2K Voice. That's how you can come in and have a voice on the show. And I was trying to write that number down myself so I won't forget it during the show, but my pen don't work all of a sudden. So what we're going to do is we're going to just keep right on moving along. It's kind of a tough time right now. A lot of veterans have been shut up with the quarantines and so forth, especially ones who have problems getting out. If you are a veteran, you know of a veteran, you're a family member of a veteran, and they're having a hard time, please reach out to the Veterans Crisis Line at 1-800-273-8255 and support it. You press 1. So always want to make sure that that you're out there, you're watching the show, or and have periods of time. Depression is a weird thing, and post-traumatic stress. You notice I didn't say PTSD. It is not a disorder. But moving right along, we'll start the show now. What we're talking about is understanding the Vietnam War. It's a rant that was put together by Tom Fryer, who was in Vietnam from 65 and 66. I believe it was one of the best things I have read on the Vietnam War. He sent this to me, and tried to get him on the show, but he didn't want to be on, so he told me I could use it. So he says, victory is ours, but we're not allowed to win. And that's, a lot of us got that idea. So how can we, who fulfill our duty to serve honorably, retreat from seeking the truth? And that's what we're talking about. The violent act in most of our Vietnam veteran social media groups today is a thorny issue. No political post. Your post will be deleted and you could be removed from the group. Arguing over political issues of the war is often poorly received and becomes fruitless. When a political post alienates a brother or sister who may have different opinions, those disagreements often boil over into arguments, and many threaten to leave the group. On the other hand, What we're talking about here is some of the different Vietnam veteran groups uh, on Facebook and so forth. Plus, anytime you get a group of veterans together. On the other hand, from a conflicting point of view, there is a grave danger to the status quo, politically correct. Thinking of not talking about the politics of the Vietnam War, avoiding productive discussions about the politics of war has led to misunderstanding of the war, pent up emotions, and divisions among the veterans. There's more at stake here than our social media groups concerned about losing members. The collective edict of our conscience ought to be, how can the Vietnam Brotherhood refrain from talking about the politics of the Vietnam War when the war was the most politicized, mismanaged, misunderstood, and misrepresented war in the history of our country? How can we, who were there, permit history to be muzzled by rewritten for future generations? How can we, who return home, permit the discussion to continue that those whose names are etched in the black granite have died in vain? Our emotional strong bond is a consequence of the ingrained, hurtful memories of the anti-war movement deflected to us. The steadfast soldiers, the deep-rooted feelings of the betrayed, that the crippling rules of engagement with a mindset to achieve political ends conveyed, and those painful memories of the disloyalty demonstrated at our homecoming and in the days that followed with the insults, name-calling, and ingratitude. The Vietnam War has been rewritten by the biased historians and journalists, misrepresented by academia, and distorted in Hollywood movies and in most media forms, and more recently by the Ken Burns documentary. So, in all these circumstances, how can we, the Brotherhood, retreat from seeking the truth? Just about every Vietnam veteran today knows that the war was politically motivated and cold-heartedly mishandled. However, we are not all in agreement as to the truthful history of the war, who was responsible, and what that mindset was to accomplish the political ends. For most of us, our opinions of the war were shaped as young, innocent, and uninformed soldiers. And today, based on Vietnam veterans chat room comments, many still have a strong desire to defend those early opinions. They regard as their truth when there is a strong evidence to the contrary. Over time, for many of us, those opinions have changed to uncovering those political, imposed, and alleged untruths. Can we be honest with ourselves and not be self-deceived? Self-deception is believing that things that are not true and trying to fool oneself into believing things that are not true without seeking the truth. So after all, we have been through, how can the Brotherhood be divided? Can we unite and bear witness to the factual history of the war that has impacted you? I can't even read tonight. Our nation and the honor of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. And let's not forget our allies who served and died, and all South Vietnamese who perished, or who were tortured, driven out of their homeland, or put in re-education camps and lost their freedom. The intent is not to crash through doors already open with the great works by many patriot writers who have uncovered the truths of the war, especially the following books: H.R. McMaster's in his book, Dereliction of Duty, or The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Vietnam War by Philip Jennings, or in Top Gun by Dan Peterson and Shelby Stanton's book, The Rise and Fall of American Army. Stanton's book is a well-researched and written book with a complete history of ground forces in Vietnam. Those truth-revealing books are a must-read for every Vietnam veteran. The original intention of writing this rant was to keep an old veteran's mind active, triggered by a desire to personally come to an understanding of the war. However, that desire became an urgency after a few years in our veterans and social media chat rooms when the division and misunderstanding of the war among our Vietnam veteran brothers became a concern and a frustration. So the mission is to find the truthful history of the war, who was responsible, and what was the mindset to accomplish political ends, then come to an understanding of the war. So, number two, with that understanding, come to peace with the war. And three, with the peace, unite, defend, and share those truths. That's an awesome mission there. Then together we can stand tall for what we have fulfilled our duty, not only to our conscience, but most importantly, to those who don't have a voice, our brothers who have paid the ultimate sacrifice. But take notice, don't expect this rant to follow an essay writing and grammar guidelines. This is exactly what it says. An incoming rant directed to the Brotherhood. It's armed and aimed to bring the foremost truths of the war to light. It's a rant emotionally charged, but with objective and rational thought. Somewhat repetitious, but for a cause. A rant fortified with facts, not opinion. I'm going to read that again because I think it's important. A rant fortified with facts, not opinions. Facts which uncover, isolate, and under examinations and questions expose those pertinent untruths of the war. The truth never fears investigation. As those truths unfold, under main headings, it will become evident that they are not one's opinions, but armor-plated facts. And while those truths will rise to the surface, will justice and what was once the American way find the light of day? The anti-war movement was described as being a spontaneous, unplanned movement by hippie pacifists triggered by the buildup and increase in draftings. However, it was a well-organized anti-war movement as directed by over 24 organizations involved in the movement. From hardcore socialists and communist radicals using civil disobedience in direct action against military action to soldiers against the war. Both the spontaneous, unplanned movement and those planned were directed at the current administration, but it was deflected to the serving soldiers. Anti-war movement supported with relentless TV coverage, severed public confidence, demonized soldiers, and aided and assisted not only the enemy, but if you have a fact-finding mind, it became evident. It provided cover for the Democrats' war on poverty and the Great Society. While we were at war, America was at home in front of the TV sets. The Democrats were busy pushing through their socialist programs in Congress. In questions and answers, an interview with North Vietnamese General Giap, that's him there. The question was the American anti-war movement important to victory? General Giap says, those people represented the conscience of America. The conscience of America was part of its war-making capability, and we were turning that power in our favor. America lost because of its democracy. Through dissent and protest, it lost the ability to mobilize a will to win. General Giap goes on to say, it was essential to our strategy. Support for the war from our rear was completely secured while the American rear was vulnerable. Every day, our leadership would listen to world news over the radio at 9 a.m. to follow the growth of the American anti-war movement. Visits to Hanoi by people like Jane Fonda and former Attorney General Ramsey Clark and ministers gave us confidence that we should hold on in the face of battlefield reverse. We were elated with Jane Fonda wearing a red Vietnamese dress, said at a press conference that she was ashamed of American actions in the war and that she would struggle along with us. The conscience of the individual rotation policy. Anti-war movement discussed above, restricted command tactics and rules of engagement for political reasons discussed below, and the civil rights flare-ups at home assuredly have all contributed to the dissatisfaction and frustration of soldiers who sometimes use frags and other explosives to threaten or kill officers and NCOs they dislike. It was reported in Chapter 11, American Military History, Volume 2. The full extent of the problem will never be known, but it increased sharply in 1969, 1970, and 1971 when the morale of the troops declined in step with the American role in the fighting. A total of 730 well-documented cases among 83 fragging deaths have come to light. According to Colonel Robert D. Hanel, who wrote in the Armed Forces Journal, the Army was in a near state of collapse due to lack of discipline among the troops. When these troops found themselves serving under an incompetent leader, a harsh disciplinarian, or a vain, glory-seeking leader who risked his troops' lives in order to further his own career, they would sometimes seek to have that leader killed. This was often accomplished by rolling a fragmentation grenade in his tent while he was sleeping. The grenade will leave no fingerprints after explosions, so there was no evidence of who committed a deed. The term fragging comes from this common method. Families were not typically made aware of the true nature of their loved ones' deaths. While fragmentation grenades were the common method inside the camp, soldiers found other methods while away from camp. Frequently, an undesirable officer would find himself in the line of fire during a firefight and would accidentally struck by friendly fire. Johnson's political interfering and mindset to achieve political ends became decidedly evident as we discuss our next rock-solid proofs. Clear-cut military tactical objectives and strategy on how victory could be achieved were presented by the military command, but disallowed Johnson's political meddling, his crippling rules of engagement, and the Democratic-controlled Congress all pull rank on military logic. Victory was ours, but we're not allowed to win. We were betrayed. We must begin with the crippling rules of engagement by Paul Schmel. The following truths support a consistent view of the war that there was a theme of deception, restraining, or destructive military means with a mindset to achieve political ends. Johnson called his generals in for photo ops, but did not heed the battle-tested advice of the military masterminds of the day that Clausewitz, we talked about before, on war spoke of. Johnson's following politicized military rules of engagement pull rank on military logic and goes against the grain of common sense and moral decency. The crippling rules of engagement will leave an awful feeling in the pit of your stomach. They're a slap in the face of all veterans, and once again will start the flow of tears in the eyes of those familiar and friends who lost a warrior, and will make all those who read them scream, "Why?" And where was the Ken Burns documentary on exposing this diversity? Paul Schmel writes, the rules of engagement were drawn from three different sources: the President and Secretary of Defense, through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Commander of the Military Assistance Command, and the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Command, except if you were operating in Laos. Then the State Department set the rules. There are two primary facets to the rules of engagement: the air war and the ground war. The following are lawful targets according to the laws of war. Now, these are the following are the lawful targets: military complexes, equipment and supplies, economic places, and economic places of power, industrial war supporting import and export, transportation, equipment lines of communication, petroleum, political sites, geographic, personnel, military, and there were civilians that participated in hostilities. The targets that the United States military were permitted to attack from the air per Secretary McManus were transportation, military outside of populated areas, air wars. Pilots could not attack targets that were not on the approved list. Such as Hanoi and Haiphong, had 30-mile perimeters that were no bombing zones. A 30-mile perimeter on the northern border of North Vietnam prevented pursuit of attacking MiG fighters. In other words, Americans couldn't go within 30 miles of the North Vietnam border, which would happen to be a place called China. Rail yards and switch stations were off limits. Airfields were off limits. MiGs could only be shot at if they were airborne, clearly identified and displaying hostile intent. SAM sites, SAM missiles, sites could only be attacked if they attacked first. If they didn't shoot a missile at you, you don't supposed to shoot them. SAM sites and anti-aircraft sites could not be attacked while they were under construction. These are the actual rules. Locks, dams, and dikes could never be attacked. Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, is completely below sea level with the locks and dikes around it. Hydroelectric plants could not be attacked. Military targets could not be attacked if they were in protected zones. Tanks, trucks in Laos and North Vietnam could not be attacked unless they were on a road and displayed hostile intent. That's a truck display hostile. Okay. Military trucks parked more than 200 meters from a road could not be attacked. So if that truck was 200 meters from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, you couldn't touch it. Pilots had to travel routes specified by Washington and would face court-martial if they disobeyed. So they had to fly the same routes each day so that the communists would know how they were coming. The People's Army of Vietnam, the communists, knew these routes and placed all their anti-aircraft defense on those routes, forcing American pilots to run a gauntlet of enemy fire to complete their mission. Are you asking why yet? They were forced to fly over targets in weather so bad they could not release their bombs, but still had to face the enemy's radar-controlled ground fire. Pilots in South Vietnam could not provide an air support to ground troops, even if fired upon, unless they got clearance, and they first had to drop leaflets warning possible civilians to clear the area. The average time in Laos between the discovery of a target and permission to strike was 15 days. Senator John Stennis, chairman of the Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee, stated in 1967 that the air campaign was not achieving its objective to a greater extent cannot be attributed to importance or inability of air power. It attests rather to the fragmentation of our air might by overly restrictive controls, limitations, and the doctrine of gradualism placed on our aviation forces, which prevented them from waging the air campaign in the manner and according to the timetable which was best calculated to achieve maximum results. The subcommittee found that Secretary of Defense McNamara and President Johnson had discounted the unanimous professional judgment of U.S. commanders and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and substituted civilian judgment to the details of target selection and the timing of strikes. In 1972, President Nixon authorized all of the targets that the Joint Chiefs of Staff requested, with the exception of 3. The results were reported by Admiral Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war in Hanoi Hilton at the time. That's Admiral Stockdale, a POW. This is what Stockdale has to say. At dawn, The streets of Hanoi were absolutely silent. The usual patriotic wake-up music was missing. The familiar street sounds, the horns, all gone. In prison, interrogators and the guards would inquire about our needs solicitously. Unprecedented morning coffee was delivered to our cell blocks. One look at any Vietnamese officer's face told the whole story. It telegraphed accommodation, hopelessness, remorse, and fear. The shock was there. Our enemy's will was broken. The sad thing was that we all knew what we were seeing could have been done in any 10-day period in the previous 7 years and saved lives of thousands, including most of those 57,000 dead Americans. This is the lessons this is the ground war rules of engagement that was thought about. Commanders in direct contact with the enemy in uninhabited areas could release direct artillery fire without prior authorization. Commanders in direct contact with the enemy in inhabited areas could not authorize direct fire if their mission was in jeopardy and the enemy was positively identified only for defensive purposes. Let me read that correctly. Commanders in direct contact with the enemy in inhabited areas could only authorize direct fire if their mission was in jeopardy and the enemy was positively identified and only for defensive purposes, like you're getting ready to be overrun. Indirect fire could only be utilized after approval of the province chief or the province where the fire would be directed. No artillery could be fired in areas where friendly troops were not operating without their prior use of leaflets or loudspeakers, even if enemy fire was received from the area. Direct fire against enemy forces that were not in direct contact in inhabited areas required approval of both the province chief and the battalion commander. Indirect fire missions in inhabited areas required the approval of the province chief, the battalion commander, and the dropping of leaflets or the use of loudspeakers to warn civilians prior to commencement. Cordon and search missions could only be conducted with the approval of the district and village chief, as well as the U.S. commander, and Republic of Vietnam advisors must accompany all missions. Attacks in uninhabited areas required that the commander explain to the inhabited areas required that the commanders explain to the inhabitants why the action was initiated after the attack was over. You had to go back in and say, this is why we did that. Fleeing enemy troops could be engaged unless they were first ordered to, could not be engaged unless they were first ordered to halt and failed to obey. Then they must be fired upon with the intent to wound only by firing at the lower extremities. The much discussed free fire zones had to have prior approval from Republic of Vietnam political authorities and were still restricted by all the other rules of engagement. Senator Barry Goldwater was so appalled by the rules of engagement that he had them entered in the congressional record along with this statement. This is what Barry Goldwater had to say. Mr. President, I ask this because I think it is very, very necessary for the members of this body, the public, the press, and media to understand fully the restrictions that were placed upon all our forces in South Vietnam. It is absolutely unbelievable that any Secretary of Defense would ever place such restrictions on our forces. It is unbelievable that any president would have allowed this to happen. I think on the reading of these restrictions, members of this body will begin to understand a better way just what happened to the American military power in South Vietnam. As I say, it is unbelievable. I am ashamed of my country for having had people who have allowed such restrictions to have been placed upon men who were trained to fight, men who were trained to make decisions to win war, and men who were risking their lives. I dare say that these restrictions had as much to do with our casualties as the enemy themselves. And that is a list of sources that Tom got the information from. But I believe there were many reasons, not just one, why the Vietnam War ended so miserably. Here are some reasons in no particular order from former NVA Colonel Bowie 10, who served in the General Staff and received unconditional surrender of South Vietnam on April 30th, 1975. And this is what he had to say about the Americans. We didn't block Haiphong at the onset where even British ship vessels could be found. Haiphong Harbor is where the Gulf of Tonkin came from, but that was a big shipping point. We didn't knock out the railway lines between China and North Vietnam. U.S. ground forces were not allowed to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If they had, Hanoi could never have won the war. Though North Vietnam clearly violated Cambodian and Laotian sovereignty, U.S. forces were not allowed to continue chasing or hot pursuit the NVA of Viet Cong when they retreated back across the same borders. Anti-war movement was essential to our strategy. The senior leadership followed the anti-war movement in the U.S. and were elated when Jane Fonda, Ramsey Clark, and others visited. America lost because of its democracy through dissent and protest. It lost the ability to mobilize a will to win. South Vietnam's generals were inept and political. A lot of the generals in South Vietnam were there because of their political power or their money, bought the position. No military training whatsoever. The bombing of North Vietnam, if it had been concentrated as in the Christmas bombing, would have hurt our efforts. Piecemeal bombing gave the North time to reshuffle and rebuild. In other words, you go in and bomb, and you don't bomb again for another 6 months. When you go back, it's been rebuilt. The NFL National Liberation Front, or the Communists, was controlled by Hanoi. It was never independent, which is the Viet Cong. It was always run by a Communist Party commissar, despite its efforts to convince the American public and politicians otherwise. Regional and popular forces, Rough Puff, were in control of 90% of the populous countryside by 1972. That was the ones fighting for us, the local villages and so forth. The often forgotten People's Self-Defense Force were there in the rural hamlets too. We had the impression that American commanders had their hands tied by political factors. Your generals could never deploy a maximum force for greatest military effort. North only had to win over American media in order to eventually be victorious because they swayed politicians who loved to be loved and, of course, reelected. And there were feeble-minded universal professors who loved to pontificate and sell their books. Because fewer people read books today, let's not forget the pseudo-documentarians and Hollywood types who insist on stating or insinuating how bad the military was in Vietnam and how the communist forces were the good guys or merely misunderstood. The same type of things also occurred in fictional accounts of wartime events. If they are especially outrageous, they are almost likely to be visualized humanities and promoted as if the events actually happened. In these cases, the historian seems to be the director and the movie studios. In typical Hollywood fashion, it is more concerned with making a profit. Taking a slap at the military is almost always good for business when it comes to Vietnam. So it is supported by the other crippling rules of engagement by Paul Schmel, the crucial blunders of the anti-war Johnson political meddling, his abuse of political mismanaging the war and not listening to military advice, and enforced his crippling rules of engagement. Henry Kissinger's book, Ending the Vietnam War, said Johnson rarely confided in his generals. Years before President Eisenhower, listening to his generals, concluded that the defense of South Vietnam had to begin in Laos. Note on the Southeast Asian map, which you'll be seeing in a moment, it is obvious geopolitical advantage. A key military blunder by Johnson was not allowing his generals to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a key military advantage that Johnson handed over to North Vietnam. Today, historians write, failing to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the greatest military strategy mistake of the 20th century. Not shutting down the Ho Chi Minh Trail resulted in the North Vietnamese with refugees from which they could send troops, refuges, hiding places from which they could send troops and supplies into the battle throughout South Vietnam during the entire war. Attacks, ambushes, booby traps, encounter could be at any place at any time. The NVA and Viet Cong had the decisive advantage of surprise, terrain, and a 360-degree attack, not to mention reconnaissance and intelligence gathering advantage. The North Vietnamese were using their sanctuaries in the allegedly neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia as staging areas in the flagrant violation of 2 Geneva Accords. We honored the neutrality, but did not put the ARVN combat troops in Laos and Cambodia until late in the war to stop North Vietnamese from doing their in around, but it was a little too late. Let's have a little history lesson on this infamous trail, so one can understand why Laos was the key to preventing the domino effect or the spread of communism in Southeast Asia and the defense of South Vietnam. After the Geneva Accords of 1954 and the Sito Treaty of North Vietnam annexed the panhandle of sovereign Laos and established bases areas both there and in Cambodia without significant opposition. The panhandle of Laos provided North Vietnam with access routes under jungle canopy of some 650 miles along the entire border of South Vietnam with Laos and Cambodia. They would take trees and bend them over, and you couldn't see the trails, almost like a tunnel. The Ho Chi Minh Trail grew out of a network of footpaths, trails, and secondary roads that had been employed by Viet Minh guerrillas during the 1946-1954 struggle against the French colonial rule. As early as 1958, the DRV, anticipating the resumption of overt armed conflict in South Vietnam, began laying the foundation for a logistical pipeline by training personnel to establish way stations and guide systems in Laos. During the 1959 to 1964 period, Hanoi created the trail's key logistical infrastructure, including truck parks, repair depots, vehicle shelters, and food storage and distribution facilities. And you can see where he got the information from to its facts. That is the map. As you can see, the Ho Chi Minh Trail comes out and starts in Laos and works its way down with the different fingers and so forth. Vietnam Ho Chi Minh Trail timeline states, May 1959, North Vietnamese established a central office of South Vietnam, COSVN, to oversee the coming war in the South. Construction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail now begins. The trail will eventually expand into a 1,500-mile long network of jungle and mountain passes extended from North Vietnam's coast along Vietnam's western border through Laos and parts of Cambodia, funneling a constant stream of soldiers and supplies into the highlands of South Vietnam. In 1959, it takes 6 months to make the journey. By 1968, it takes only 6 weeks due to road improvements by the North Vietnamese laborers, many of whom are women. In 1970s, a parallel fuel pipeline will be added. At least they got a pipeline. Failing to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a key military strategy mistake. However, the ultimate blunder of the war was Johnson's political meddling. His abuse of power, not listening to the military advice, and the senselessness of crippling rules of engagement. Review the crippling rules of engagement section as pertaining to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Remember, Australian General Clausewitz on war, page 90, said the fighting forces must be destroyed, and that is, they must be put in such a condition they can no longer carry on the fight. Whenever we use the phrase destruction of the enemy forces, this alone is what we mean, Napoleon said. War was so horrible that it should be carried out with much violence as possible so to end it quickly. That was even Napoleon didn't want for a long war. If Johnson wanted to win a limited war, why did he honor the neutrality but let the North Vietnamese, who did not honor neutrality, do their in around using these sanctuaries in the allegedly neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia? Had he successfully cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam could not have won the war. Why didn't he heed the second reasoning of Eisenhower, who said the defense of South Vietnam begins in Laos? Why didn't he take advice of his general, Westmoreland, to shut down the trail early in the war? Why didn't he listen to Marine General Krulak, who wanted to take ground and hold it? He wanted to secure South Vietnamese village by village and combine it with strategic bombing of North Vietnam, suggested by Admiral Sharp. All tactics we were not allowed to use. Why did Johnson disallow our combat soldiers from crossing the 17th parallel and take the fight into North Vietnam? Why didn't Johnson allow bombing of the major economic, industrial, and military targets in North Vietnam? Or, note, Laos, a strategic location in defense of South Vietnam, to avoid using Agent Orange in the south and spray the rice crops of North Vietnam to destroy their breadbasket, rather than putting our soldiers in the south in harm's way. Why didn't he learn lessons from the French? I'm going to go back to that. Why didn't he spray Agent Orange in the North Vietnam and instead of spraying all over our allies and our troops? French historians and journalists had studied every aspect of the country and its culture during and after their defeat in the French Indochina War. Much of this study had been translated into English. By the time you finish with this rant, you too will understand why. Also, don't you think China and Russia thought we had the upper hand if this limited war turned into a nuclear war? As you can see, but they got Ho Chi Minh Trail again. You'll see that when Nixon approved bombing those major targets in the North in 1972, linebacker 2, it led Hanoi to signing the Paris Peace Accord. Johnson was self-deceived within his crippling rules of engagement and thinking it would keep China and Russia out of the war. On May 6, 1989, China admitted that it had 320,000 combat troops, had sent 320,000 combat troops to Vietnam to fight against U.S. forces and their South Vietnamese allies. So they were already heavily involved. However, there were some estimates as high as 500,000 Chinese who fought in Vietnam. It was also kept quiet that Russian soldiers were killed. It was reported that more than 3,000 Soviet soldiers fought in the conflict despite years of government denials that were never, ever involved. If you didn't listen to the military masterminds of the day how victory could be achieved, you either listen to the advice of your generals or you stay out of Southeast Asia. And Hanoi learned lessons from 8 years of fighting the French. Today, historians and countless mediums fault General Westmoreland with unjustified blame for losing the war. Many blame General William C. Westmoreland's wrong combat tactics in the years of 1964 and 68. In General Westmoreland Internet Search Day, you are directed to the Huffington Post, who writes, Westmoreland is the worst general in American warfare history. And James J. Carafano, a leading expert in national security and foreign policy challenges, writes, General William Westmoreland earns a spot in the Hall of Military Shame. He was called the inevitable general. A West Point graduate, he served in World War II and Korea. When it came to military command, Westmoreland was everybody's All-American until he met his Waterloo. He bears a lot of responsibility for one of the greatest reversals of military fortune ever experienced by a superpower. Westmoreland is branded as the biggest scapegoat of the war. In reality, tactical objectives and strategy on how victory could be achieved were presented by Westmoreland, but were disallowed. Westmoreland presented the strategies to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail early in the war, but they were rejected by Johnson for political reasons. Johnson also refused to grant Westmoreland permission to conduct ground operations in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. And when Nixon extended the war into Cambodia, they called it Nixon's Secret War, and the calls rang out for his impeachment. And when Westmoreland wanted additional troops after the Tet Offensive to go to the Snake's Head and defeat the NVA, Johnson said no. So with his hand tied, rather than resigning, Westmoreland carried out Johnson's demands and became politicized. Self-deceit. He thought he could define victory by employing the strategy of attrition with an aggressive strategy of search and destroy by drawing forces of Viet Cong into the open where they could be eliminated. Westmoreland believed that the Viet Cong could be defeated through large-scale use of artillery, air power, and large unit battles by a war of attrition. General Westmoreland argued that we're going to out-guerrilla the guerrillas and out-ambush the ambush because we're smarter, we have greater mobility and firepower, we have more endurance and more to fight for, and we've got more guts. It is said that not one American officer above the rank of lieutenant colonel resigned in protest over the course of the entire U.S. involvement. Nobody had the nerve to step up. The proof that Westmoreland was handicapped by LBJ, who refused to grant him permission, comes from Johnson's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. In later years, McNamara admitted the reason for getting into the war was made up. He went on to say, if Johnson had granted General Westmoreland's request to enter Laos and block the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Hanoi could not have won the war. The North Vietnamese knew that Johnson would not put any boots on the ground in Hanoi or go into Laos and Cambodia and shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North, as indicated in a question and answer from North Vietnamese General Giap, we had the impression that American commanders had their hands tied by political factors. Your generals could never deploy maximum force for greatest military effort. Doesn't that sound familiar to what Australian General Clausewitz on war General Giap? It was essential to our strategy. Support for the war from our rear was completely secure while the American rear was vulnerable. When it was over, General Giap and the NVA viewed the Tet 68 offensive as a failure. They had prepared to negotiate a surrender. The NVA were prepared to accept their defeat. Then they heard Walter Cronkite, former CBS News and anchor and correspondent on TV, proclaiming the success of the Tet offensive by the communist NVA. I know I was there. According to Giap, those distorted reports were inspirational to the NVA. They changed their plans from a negotiated surrender and decided instead they only needed to persevere for one more hour, day, week, or month, and eventually the protesters in America would help them to achieve a victory they knew they could not win on the battlefield. Folks, that's profound. You might want to go back and read that yourself a little later. However, today, a number of fact-finding sites have today reported they were never quoted by Giap in his memoirs. However, they may have been quoted by Colonel Bui Tien, who served on their general staff and received unconditional surrender of South Vietnamese on April 30th, 1975. According to a naval fighter pilot, Dan Peterson, founder of the Top Gun program, in his 2019 book, Top Gun, Johnson's political meddling and restricted rules of engagement not only limited to the ground war. Some more factual information from Top Gun, Peterson said, Johnson and McNamara micromanaged the losing the air war from Washington, D.C., going as far as to pick our targets. There were 150 worthwhile things to bomb in North Vietnam: airfields, military bases, supply facilities, power plants, bridges, rail centers, oil and lubricant facilities, a few steel mills, and, of course, Haiphong's major port facilities. Large convoys of weapons and war materials flowed across the border to North Vietnam. The enemy had sanctuary to bring in whatever was needed, and for years, afraid of escalating the war, Johnson administration refused to sanction attacks on Haiphong Harbor or the shipping there. But we couldn't hit them. But we couldn't hit them, and we couldn't mine the harbor. The execution of an aerial mining plan would have shut down the harbor, which we did later at the end. When the North Vietnamese began flying Russian and Chinese MiG fighters, the Navy and Air Force asked Washington for permission to bomb their airfields. Request was denied. The Hanoi Haiphong Sound missile sites were initially placed off limits for fear of killing Soviet or Chinese technicians working there. U.S. reconnaissance aircraft had located 56 multiple launch SAM sites. The Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Pacific Command, Admiral USS Grant Sharp, had overall responsibility for the air war, urged the Joint Chiefs of Staff to lift the crippling restrictions. Our pilots couldn't fire on a MiG until they had a visual. We couldn't bomb SAM missile sites because they were placed in populated areas of Hanoi. Read Chapter 6, The Path of Disillusionment, of this much-read book to get the full context, and a sickening feeling of the pit of your stomach because of the crippling rules of engagement. Note, 8,000 pilots were killed during the war. The Top Gun program was formed in 1968 and successfully put fully into operation under Nixon in 1972 during the successful Linebacker II raids. And additional commentaries on the misuse of air power, you can go to that website and see more. Targets were selected by Washington by a small team on the Joint Staff and approved only at the presidential level. Results was a major misuse of air power. Air power applications came to simply be the servicing of targets with little regard for whether or not they were the right targets, and without any air campaign plan. Surface parochialism dominated the air effect, lacking a single responsible air commander, a clear set of objectives, and a common concept of operation. Even the most skilled operations of the separate components tended to work at cross purpose and give respite to the enemy. But it becomes very clear that it could have been a very short war in 1965 if they had spontaneously lifted the crippling rules of engagement on land and air. Number 2, had gone into Laos and shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And 3, applied the Linebacker II B-52 raids on major targets as Nixon did in 1972. If there were no clear-cut strategic tactical objectives to work together on the ground. Or C, how could victory be achieved? You either listen to or follow the advice of your military masterminds before you politicize them, or you stay out of Southeast Asia. The Tet Offensive, January 30th, 1968, an outright victory for the U.S., was depicted by the media as a stalemate that the Vietnam War simply couldn't be won by any conventional militarized standard and was a turning point for Hanoi. We were on victory's doorsteps, but we were not allowed to win. It's important to focus on the 1968 Tet Offensive, which I think is interesting, so we're getting into it. Because many news outlets reported the Tet Offensive as a turning point in the war for North Vietnam. It helped to strengthen U.S. public opinion against the war. Today, the History Channel dishonestly writes the media's coverage of Tet overall, honest, fair-minded, unflinching, shaped America's evolutionary views that the Vietnam War simply couldn't be won by any conventional military standard. In truth, it was biased reporting that helped to fortify U.S. public opinion against the war. Luke Hunt, in The Diplomat, truthfully wrote about the Tet Offensive. A communist uprising across South Vietnam claimed thousands of lives, and their perceived success had turned public opinion against the war by the middle of 1968. The abject lesson in propaganda, its latter-day magnification, fake news. But the American people were misled by the media. The Tet Offensive was both a military and political failure for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong communists. They did not succeed in sustaining control over any part of South Vietnam and suffered an estimated 45,000 killed. They failed to topple the government in Saigon or persuade the city dwellers and Hamlet rice farmers in the countryside to join their cause. After the war, General Gipp and his NVA viewed the Tet Offensive as a failure, so they had prepared to negotiate a surrender. They were prepared to accept their defeat. Then Walter Cronkite, most trusted man in news, came on TV announcing the success of the Tet 68 offensive by the communist NVA. The misleading media also reported another untruth. The Tet Offensive showed another side of the war to America, one which did not like. The coordination, strength, and surprise instigated by the communists led the U.S. to realize that their foe was much stronger than they had expected. In actuality, the Tet Offensive was a military victory and a turning point in the war for U.S. and ARVNs, South Vietnamese troops. It is reported throughout South Vietnam that local officials and communists gained confidence as began apparent that the Viet Cong were effectively finished as a fighting force. So South Vietnam was emotionally getting stronger after that defeat. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were unquestionably defeated during the Tet Offensive. In the first week of the attack, the NVA BC communists lost 32,204 confirmed killed and 5,803 captured. U.S. losses were 1,015 KIA killed in action, while ARVN losses were 2,819 killed. ARVN losses were higher because the NVA and BC, reluctant to enter into a battle with U.S. forces, attacked the targets defended almost exclusively by South Vietnamese troops. But with all the NVA and VC losses, wouldn't one think it was a turning point for the U.S. and ARVN forces? General Westmoreland had requested 206,000 additional troops, and the president declined to commit. Rather than taking advantage of our Tet Offensive victories and striking while going for the snake's head by taking the war in Hanoi, Johnson caved to the criticism by the noted nightly TV reporter and anti-war protests and to the eroding public support for his handling of the war. They gave him what they were already asking for. President Lyndon Johnson decided to end the escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, conceded the war. He went on TV on March 31st, 1968, announced a bombing halt to the halt of the North and America's willingness to meet with the North Vietnamese to seek a peace agreement. In other words, let me reread that. He called a halt for the bombing of the North, and he also talked about America's willingness to meet with the North Vietnamese to seek a peace settlement. In June of 1968, down his ability to command, Westmoreland was replaced by General Creighton Adams. Then on October 31st, 1968, Johnson ordered a complete halt to all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam. And the Rolling Thunder campaign launched in 1965 came to an end. Robert McNamara resigned. Once again, we must ask the important why question. How was the 68 Tet Offensive portrayed as a victory and turning point in the war for the North Vietnamese by the American press and a Democratic-controlled Congress? Now it becomes apparent that the actual political motivation of the war wasn't to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, but for those reasons they already discussed. The primary reason is found in the 1967-68 congressional record. In reality, it becomes the turning point for the Democratic-controlled Congress. They wanted to end the war to finance their war on poverty and the Great Society. The Ken Burns Vietnam War documentary also keeps the American people in the dark on this subject. Although Tet Offensive was an American victory, our intelligence efforts for failure to predict its coming, it's blamed on both Johnson and Westmoreland. It was supposed to have been a surprise. It is reported that the Tet Offensive buildup began in mid-1967, which ultimately saw 7 regiments and 20 battalions move south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But isn't this understandable now knowing the crippling rules of engagement and not shutting down the infamous trail? Why did Johnson change course? All the moderate Democrats who had voted to send troops into South Vietnam turned into a born-again left-wing radicals, claiming they had always opposed the war. However, it was reported the loss of political will on the part of the Democratic Party, not of military defeat, which caused the downfall of South Vietnam. But the truth in 1967-68, when the war didn't end as promised, the Democratic Party of Congress, Democratic members of Congress took the floor wanting Johnson to end the war so they could finance the war on poverty. Victories read the 67-68 congressional record. The president declined to commit the 206,000 additional troops in which General Westmoreland had requested. On March 31st, 68, he announced a curve in the bombing of North Vietnam. The primary reason is found in 1967-68 congressional records. In reality, it became the turning point for the Democratic-controlled Congress. All the moderate Democrats who had voted to send troops into South Vietnam turned again, we said, into left-wing radicals claiming they had always opposed the war. However, it was reported the loss of political will, again, I've read that. That is tonight's show. We'll be doing a third part because we couldn't get through on coming up. Next show will be third part, and that will be, let's see, it is going to be the 10th day of February. We'll be doing this third part. Also, I think that's an interesting day. Let's see. Also, if you're coming up the 6th of February, the 12 o'clock noon POWMI ceremony has been done for the last 33 years. If you're in the capital area, I highly recommend that you attend the 12 o'clock noon. Be sure and go down and watching the reading name. You may even take part. Thank you again for watching the Lessons of Vietnam show. So I had to read all that stuff, but I think it's important to get Tom's information out there because it, like I said, there's a lot of good information out there. Y'all have a great evening. Be safe. Wash your hands, wear your mask, whatever, and get the shot when you get the opportunity. Thank y'all and good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.